On December 31st, 2006, the British government sent a final payment of $83 million to the United States. With that single transfer, Britain closed a financial obligation that had begun in 1946. In other words, more than 60 years after the Second World War ended, British citizens were still paying for it. 3 generations had contributed to a bill that stretched across an entire era. But here's the part almost no one is ever taught. Britain was not paying America for winning the war. Britain was paying America for the right to remain in the war. That final installment was merely the last page in a much larger economic story, one built on leverage, crisis, and the transformation of global power. Between 1940 and 1945, while Britain fought for its survival, the United States oversaw one of the largest transfers of wealth in modern history. At the start of the war, Britain was the world's greatest creditor and controlled a vast empire. By the end, it was deeply indebted, stripped of its reserves, and financially dependent on Washington. This transformation was not the product of charity. It was the outcome of a carefully engineered financial strategy labeled as help. What follows is a clear explanation of how wartime aid operated, how British assets were forced onto American markets, why U.S. support stopped the moment Japan surrendered, and how the 1946 loan ensured that British economic power would never fully recover. This is not just a story about World War II. It is a story about how nations can be reshaped not only by armies, but by finance, negotiation, and debt. How Britain reached the edge of bankruptcy on December 8, 1940. Winston Churchill sent a desperate message to President Franklin Roosevelt. German U-boats were destroying Britain's merchant fleet. German bombers were leveling British cities. And the country urgently needed ships, aircraft, weapons, and raw materials. Then Churchill delivered the stunning truth. Britain had run out of money. Completely. Only 7 months into full-scale war, the nation's reserves had been burned through. School books usually frame this as a simple request for help. But the private letters show something deeper. Churchill was admitting that Britain had nothing left to offer except its remaining overseas assets and its global influence. Before 1939, Britain was economically powerful. It held vast foreign investments, controlled lucrative colonial markets, and backed its currency with one of the largest gold reserves in the world. But America, still neutral at the time, had strict laws. No credit, no loans. War materials must be paid for in gold or dollars. Cash only. Britain needed weapons, so it complied. Over the summer of 1940, Britain shipped nearly all of its gold to the United States. It was the largest physical movement of gold in recorded history. By the end of the year, the vaults were empty, yet the need for supplies was greater than ever. The hidden mechanics of Lend-Lease, the popular version of Lend-Lease, paints it as a generous program, a neighbor lending a hose while your house is burning. The real version was far more complex. Long before Lend-Lease deliveries began, the U.S. Treasury demanded a complete list of every British-owned asset worldwide. American officials refused to release aid until Britain sold its U.S.-based holdings first. Under enormous pressure, Britain was forced to liquidate some of its most valuable companies and investments at prices far below their true worth. American banks benefited enormously. One of the most striking examples involved a major U.S. manufacturing company owned by a British firm. Britain seized it under emergency powers and sold it immediately through American financial houses, losing roughly half its value in the process. By mid-1941, Britain had sold over $1 billion worth of assets, equivalent to tens of billions in today's money. Only then did Lend-Lease supplies begin to flow. And even those came with stringent conditions. The price of the 50 destroyers months before Lend-Lease, Britain had already made a strategic concession. The United States provided 50 outdated World War I-era destroyers. In exchange, Britain gave America long-term control, up to 99 years, over military bases across the Atlantic and the Caribbean. These bases expanded U.S. global military reach and diminished Britain's influence. The destroyers themselves were already obsolete. The clause that undermined the British Empire hidden near the end of the Lend-Lease agreement was a short but devastating clause. Britain would dismantle the system of trade protections, known as imperial preference, that held the empire together economically. Removing these protections opened British colonial markets to American competition. British negotiators understood the consequences. They signed anyway. They had no choice. The shock of 1945 and August 1945. Only a week after Japan surrendered, the United States abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. Ships already en route were ordered to turn back, even if they carried food and essential supplies. Britain's wartime economy relied entirely on American support. Ending it overnight pushed the country toward collapse. John Maynard Keynes traveled to Washington to negotiate a rescue package. He argued that Britain deserved a grant after years of sacrificing a loan against Germany. The United States refused. It offered a loan with interest and added strict conditions. One required that Britain make its currency freely convertible to U.S. dollars within a year. When Britain complied in 1947, foreign holders of British pounds immediately exchanged them for dollars. Reserves drained rapidly. The policy nearly destroyed Britain's financial system and had to be suspended after only a few weeks. This crisis forced Britain to withdraw from several global obligations, opening the door for the United States to assume global leadership. A debt paid across generations, the 1946 loan, included repayment terms that lasted into the 21st century. Through wars, recessions, and political change, the payments never stopped. The final installment was made in 2006. Today, many nations that host U.S. bases, rely on American defense, or hold U.S. debt are part of a pattern that first appeared in the wartime negotiations with Britain. This was not conquest by armies. It was influenced by economic pressure, conditional aid, and financial restructuring. The real lesson is simple. Global power could be won not only by force, but by finance.